Welcome to section 2.1. We're going to talk about some of the common parts of a cell. So what we mean by that is what ultimately do all cells share in common? What structures does it take to really be a cell? To be able to say that you're alive. And so there's going to be lots of different types of cells. You can see just from this one picture, this is our blood. You've got white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets and different parts, different types of cells, if you will, throughout the parts of our blood. And so we want to say, what is it that if we kind of drill down, what is it they all have to have so that they can just be a cell? And so if we're looking at this kind of universal cell, these universal cell characteristics, we're going to see the first one is one of the simplest things. You need something that is a barrier between what's outside and what's inside. And so that's going to be called the plasma, or sometimes you'll see it called the cell membrane. And so in this case, you can see it's made of these phospholipids. These are these two-tailed guys we've talked about before, and there'll be two layers of them. So there's going to be kind of an outer layer and an inner layer. So we can see those there. And now what's going to happen here is we're going to have outside of the cell is going to be on one side of this membrane, and the inside of the cell is going to be on the other. This is very significant. For a cell to live, it's got to make sure it can get all the stuff it needs. It needs to get rid of all the waste that it produces. It has to be very careful to make sure just the stuff that's supposed to gets in and out. So it's kind of like the bouncer. Although hopefully at this point you'll have a chance at getting in and out appropriately. I don't think either of us is getting in the club. But at this point, if you're looking at this idea, you'll see that the membrane is one of the most essential things. Just like we have skin that kind of divides what's in our body, what's out of our body. It's the same thing here. There's no real difference. It's not structurally the exact same because our skin's made up of dead cells, but primarily on the outside, but it's going to be made up of cells. But it's still the same idea of we want to make sure that bad cells, if you will, viruses, bacteria, certain parasites like protists and fungus, don't get into our body and wreak havoc. And so we have this layer of skin that tries to make sure that stuff that's not supposed to can't get in and can't mess you up. It's very important. If you get a cut, that's why people freak out sometimes, because that cut is an opening into your body. And it's not in any romantic way. It's just literally bacteria and things that can cause you harm can get in. And then it gives them this avenue to get right into your blood, to get into places that we do not want strangers. And so this plasma membrane is the most basic thing that we're essentially going to have. It's a skin, it's a barrier, it's whatever you want to think of it as, but it's going to help determine the in and out. What is the cell and what is not the cell. The outside is not the cell, the inside is the cell. So this is the first line that we have there to help make that decision. Now next, if you've got kind of an outside, if you will, you need to have an inside. And so that's essentially what's going to be the cytoplasm. It's your insides. So if we're using the person analogy, if you go inside of our skin, that'd be our cytoplasm. So it's all the fluids, it's going to be all of the muscles, the bones, the organs, everything inside of our skin is going to be our cytoplasm, if you will. Now for a cell, this is going to be every single thing that's inside of this membrane here, except for the nucleus. That's the only thing that we kind of ignore and treat separately. So if you're a eukaryotic cell that has a nucleus, we kind of ignore that. But everything else that's inside a cell will be cytoplasm. So you might be like, well, what's this cytosol thing? Why do we need two words? The cytosol is just where we ignore all the stuff that's not liquid. So we're going to just kind of ignore these organelles. We're going to ignore these structures. So it'd be kind of like in our bodies if we ignore the muscle and the bone and the organs, and we just focus on the fluid that's between our cells, and we focus on the blood. And so the cytosol is going to be essentially the liquid parts inside of a cell. So the cytoplasm is just a bit more broad, where the cytoplasm is the liquid parts and the organelles and non-liquid parts that are inside the cell, whereas the cytosol is just the liquid parts. So at this point, we've got an outside of a cell. That's pretty important. We've got an inside of a cell, also pretty important. So we just need to go over some of the essential things that we have to have that are part of the insides, that are part of the cytoplasm, that take care of functions that are necessary to live. So the first one will be ribosomes, or ribosomes if you prefer. I don't really care what you call it. But these are going to be these structures that are made of proteins plus RNA. So they've got two different parts that kind of merge their way together into these two globs. So you can see there's kind of the red glob and the blue glob. We call these subunits. And these guys do a very, very important thing. They make stuff. And so in this case, they make probably the most important guy that you can have. And so they will be kind of like a factory, but that factory is going to make, think about the most important thing that you have in your cells. Keep thinking. That's wrong. Okay, protein. And so all of our enzymes that we have to do the chemical reactions, and remember, there's a bunch you have to have. I know there's some that you might not have that you're grumpy about. You could be lactose intolerant or be incapable of eating certain things like gluten, and some of that could be if you're missing an enzyme that normally breaks it down. But we still need enzymes to run our metabolism, and if you're missing, if you don't have certain specific enzymes, you're dead. It's not just uncomfortable, it would be uncomfortably dead. And so we need these proteins for us to function. These proteins are structures, there are enzymes, there are signals, they do just about everything like we said before. So ribosomes will be an essential part of any cell. Even though they're small, if you look at a cell, they'll be like these little tiny dots that make your cell look like it's got acne or something. They're not by any means like a pretty or a really like prestigious organelle. You're going to look at them and just say those guys are tiny, but they do a critical role that you have to have. We have to have protein to work. And then the last thing that we're going to discuss here is going to be DNA. You don't have to have DNA in a specific place or a specific order, but you do have to have DNA because this is essentially the manual on how to make the cell. These are going to control all the proteins that we possess that the ribosomes will make for us. And so based upon which proteins you have, that will determine a lot about what you're capable of doing as a cell. It also allows you to pass on your information to your offspring, assuming you're able to reproduce, assuming you can find someone to reproduce if it's sexual. You're going to pass on this information to your offspring, which then will allow them to build the stuff that they need so that your line, your species, can continue. If you don't have DNA, you're probably not going to have proteins, period, which means you're going to be dead or abiotic, period. But even if somehow you had all the stuff you need for life, but you didn't have DNA, you couldn't pass it on. You'd be a dead end. For us to have things matter biologically, we need things to continue on. And so this is our way of passing on our specific information to the next generation. We do that via our DNA. So when you reproduce, if you reproduce, you'll ultimately be able to pass on some of your information to the child, and so some of your genes, some of your information will continue on. Now, what I want to do before we officially wrap up is I want to discuss the fact that not all cells are alike, though. Despite the fact that they do have some things in common, I want you guys to realize that there are a variety of other cell structures, cell parts, that are beyond the four things that we've discussed. And so you can see here different types of cells, nerve cells that branch off all over the place. This is a type of algae and it's got this flagella, this tail-like structure. Pollen you'll see as these little extensions that kind of stick out. You've got other stuff like skin where it's very flat and wide. You've got stuff like muscle cells that tend to be very thin and long. And I want you to realize that when you look at a cell, you're going to see that the structures that they possess, the parts that they possess, will always serve a function. For them to possess them, for them to be able to live and reproduce with them, it has to be useful. Otherwise, it wastes their energy, they do poorly, and they die. They do not make it on. Nature has its own Darwin Awards, if you will, and it's the same basic idea where individuals that don't have the proper characteristics don't make it. They don't pass on their genes. And so if you're going to pass on these genes that code for stuff, it's got to be useful somehow. So a tail-like structure should be kind of obvious. You can swim with it. And so many cells do. They can also use it for other stuff, like moving water over them in some cases, or feeding, or attaching to stuff, but it's going to serve a purpose. You'll see nerve cells connect to lots of other cells to send signals and receive signals, so it makes sense that they look kind of tree-like or root-like. When you've got a skin cell, they're trying to cover up your surface. So it makes sense that they're thin but very wide, very pancake-like, because that lets them cover up as much surface as possible. And if you're talking about a muscle cell, which is able to contract, to shrink, it makes sense for it to be long and skinny, so it can kind of contract lengthwise, which shortens it, which allows it to tug on the bone. So if my bicep shortens up here, it tugs on this bone in my arm and it can lift up my arm. The bicep is there, just look closely. You also have a tricep that's on the bottom that does the same thing. It contracts and it pulls on this side of things, so it pulls your arm down. And so as you're working out, if you work out like me, you're going to see that you're going to use these muscles, and by them contracting, which is based upon their shape, it's based upon their structures that allows them to contract, that allows us to move. And so when we talk about cells, it's okay that they have different structures than one another, but you can learn a lot by the structures that they have because that helps determine what they're capable of. And so the very last thing here as we wrap up, so why did our similarities matter so much then if we're talking about just how different a lot of cells are? What I want you guys to realize is this is very powerful evidence ultimately that can help us understand this idea of evolution and how we seem to have started off with a base model cell, a cell that did just the things it needed to do to be alive. And back then, if everything's dead, or I should say abiotic, it's not even alive at all, it's great to just be alive. You know, you have something new, something awesome, something great. Now, as eventually you get more and more offspring, you know, and some of those offspring have mutations and do different stuff, you now have to compete. And so we'll see based upon the environment that you live in, what you're trying to eat, you know, if you need to move, some of these mutations, some of these differences can be really, really good or really, really bad. And the really, really good ones, they tend to persist. Those guys lived, they passed them on, and so we started to see all these differences. But even with all these differences, we have this idea that it's the base model that's just having features added to it. If I can spell features. And so we're essentially taking the base model and saying, let's add a little flagella, a tail. And so now we can move. You know, let's take this regular base model and let's add some of these extensions so ultimately it's able to grab hold of a bee or a hummingbird or bat or whatever it is the pollen's grabbing hold of, because that's how it gets from one flower to the next to pollinate it. You know, we're going to go through and add some of these features on top of this base model, and that's what we expect with evolution, and that's what fits with what we see. Is we've got these universal characteristics, and from there we're going to be discussing as we go on all the cool things that we can kind of add to that to kind of pimp out your cell. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you guys tomorrow.